Welcome back to the story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski. This is part 13. We're trying to push through this so that we can get it finished by the end of the year. Let's jump right in. This chapter is called Outside Loot. They were halfway down the far side of the field before the sunflowers dwindled into an open patch and Edgar stopped to look around. At the bottom of the slope, the field ended at a tree-filled farmyard. The house was simple and square, with attic dormers and plain brown asphalt shingling. A long driveway hooked around behind the house to stop at a freestanding building that looked like a carriage house or shed. In front of that shed sat a battered old car. No one was walking around. No dogs lay on the back porch. No sound emanated from the small barn at the back of the yard. All he could hear was the collective hum of thousands of bees harvesting the sticky nectar glinting on the sunflower heads. The field itself was long and narrow, an alley bounded on one side by a barbed-wired fence, on the other by a solid stretch of woods. Over the treetops rose a water tower, aquamarine and round-bellied. Wide-spaced cumulus clouds languished above it all in shades of white and blue, their shadows tracing the contoured land. The name of a town was painted on the top of the water tower barrel in tall white letters, Loot. So it's L-U-T-E. I think that's Loot. He clapped the dogs over and held their muzzles in his hand and ran his fingertips around their gums to see how thirsty they were. It gave him a chance to gauge whether Essay was in the mood to bolt or to stick, whether Tinder or Babu were fretful. When he was satisfied that they would stay nearby, when the four of them agreed on that, they made their way to the edge of the field. During his thief's apprenticeship, Edgar had learned not to waste much time speculating on whether a place was unoccupied or just looked that way. It was easiest just to walk up and knock. If someone stirred inside, he could always run off. And, too, his hunger made him reckless. He downstayed the dogs as they walked it down inch by inch. They were going to have to practice that. And he strode his most innocent walk to the back door. He heard no voices inside, no television, no radio. The sash on the small square window beside the door was down and latched. He knocked. When a minute passed, long enough for someone to get out of bed and start walking across the room, long enough for someone to shout, "Who is it?" long enough for a dog to bark, he opened the screen and tested the inside knob. To his surprise, the door swung open, and he stood looking into a neat linoleumed kitchen with a Christmas floor mat just inside. He leaned in and knocked again, louder this time. The only reply was the click of the refrigerator compressor shutting off. He took one more look around, and then it was a mad dash. He threw open the refrigerator, cans of beers and bottles of Coca-Cola. He grabbed a Coke and rummaged through the cabinet drawers until he found a bottle opener and opened and upended the cold bottle against his lips. From the counter near the door, he grabbed a loaf of bread and a bag of potato chips and stepped outside and tried to stroll along, though he knew in his excitement he was heel-walking like a dope. A patch of weeds near the edge of the fields began to shake. He dove in, awkwardly signing a release before the dogs broke anyway. They weren't idiots. They knew food when they saw it coming. He ripped open the plastic wrapper on the bread and handed out slices all around. He gobbled one down himself, then another, following it with big washes of Coke. In a minute, half the bread was gone. He tore open the bag of chips and shoveled them in, chip after salty, crunchy chip. The dogs tried to jam their snouts into the bag. He clamped it shut, then parceled out the delights, with the dogs following his hand each time it disappeared. He smiled, bits of potato chip and bread showing in his teeth. The true depth of his hunger had only then become evident. The sight of all that food almost panicked him. He needed to take something modest, or he'd have fainted right there in the kitchen. He sat watching the house again, half expecting someone to barge out of the door at last, shouting and shaking a fist. The dogs panted in his face as if to say, "What are you waiting for?" Then they broke into a sprint. There was no holding back. Whoever had lived there might come back at any moment, and the opportunity would be lost. This was not going to be elegant, he thought. The dogs had not been inside a house, or any building for that matter, for many weeks. They circled skittishly at the threshold until he shooed them in. They entered slinking. He filled a big plastic bowl with tap water and put it down. They leapt forward and slobbered up the water. Spookiness vanished. while he rifled the cupboard, setting food aside as he discovered it. When he opened the refrigerator, his gaze fell on a package wrapped in white butcher paper. The purple inked label said, "Bratwurst." They ate like starved kings. They would have been gone in a few minutes and never seen the place again, and he fed them all as much as they could hold. He carried the bratwurst to the back door and tore the paper and spilled the rubbery links across the planks of the stoop. Even before they stopped writhing, the dogs were tearing at them. A jar of caramel-colored honey sat on the kitchen table, cloudy with crystallized sugar. Edgar unscrewed the top and ran a finger's worth out, then topped a bowl of Wheaties extravagantly with it and splashed milk over the top, and stood in the doorway and watched the dogs while he shoveled the concoction into his mouth. The bratwurst was almost gone before he started to eat. The dogs licked their chops and looked at him. "Okay," he signed, "stand back." He set his cereal down and emptied the water bowl and dumped the contents of a half-dozen cans of Campbell's chicken soup into it and several more of creamed corn. When his cereal was gone, their bowl had been licked clean as well, and then he walked onto the stoop with a bag of marshmallows. Holy cow, he's going to be sick. 3 brilliant white cubes sailed through the air, and he mashed one into his cheeks, grinning evilly, and began another round. Halfway through the marshmallows, he was suddenly done. He gestured the dogs back into the kitchen and began to search the kitchen methodically, sorting the food into what he could take and what he should put back. When he finished, he pulled a brown grocery sack from a mass of them behind the refrigerator and stuffed it with their trash. He put the can opener into the silverware drawer and refilled the plastic bowl with water and let the dogs drink. They pushed lethargically to their feet, stomachs belled out. Suddenly he thought it was stupid to have let them eat so much after a long, hungry stretch. That risked bloat, but they also risked starving, came the reply. He rinsed the water dish and put it under the cupboard where he'd found it. There were precious little things they could take along. A bag of jelly beans, a flat, frosty package of bacon from the freezer. While he was looking in the freezer, he found a package of stew meat, also butcher wrapped, but too big to carry. He set it in the refrigerator where the brats had been. A jelly jar with pencils and pens and packs of matches stood on the counter by the door. Out of habit, he grabbed the matches, the loot bar and grill, and dropped them into his shirt pocket. And then he searched the small bathroom off the kitchen. The medicine chest contained Bactine, and he took it. An iodine, a mercurochrome, and a scattering of small adhesive bandages in their waxed envelopes. He left them, and gauze, but no off. The dogs were milling around the kitchen when he came out. He hustled them out the door and removed his muddy shoes, and then he washed the dishes and rearranged the kitchen and wetted a towel that lay draped over the back of a chair and wiped up the dirt they'd tracked in. When he'd finished, the kitchen looked reasonably like it had before they'd arrived. The kitchen clock read 1:15. He carried the paper bag containing the evidence of their crime to the trash can behind the shed, lifting a fly-strewn bag from on top and jamming his beneath. They retired to the field. He fetched the Zebco and the satchel and walked along the fence line. Halfway up the slope, the loot water tower was visible again. He heard a rumble and noticed for the first time the railroad tracks at the bottom of the bluff beside the field. A freight train appeared from the south. Out on the road, the crossing bars dropped and the bell clanged. They watched a locomotive and 15 cars roll along. The tracks appeared to pass by loot on a tangent. That was good luck, he thought. They might try walking the rails. But not just then. A postprandial lethargy had taken hold of Edgar, and he stumbled to where the dogs lay stretched out in the shade in the lone tree overhanging the fence. Tinder lay on his back, feet raised in a posture of surrender. Babu and Essay faced the fence, chins on paws, gazes dreamily fixed on the horizon. As Edgar reached them, Essay heaved a roaring burp, licked his lips, and rolled onto her side. Edgar felt just the same. The sunflowers hid them nicely from the house. He sat down beside Babu and stroked his ruff until the dog's eyes drooped shut. Then Edgar lay back on the grass. When he woke, enormous cuneiform clouds had rolled across the sky, and between them great slant columns of afternoon sunlight tilted onto the earth. He yawned and sat up, looked around. Though evening was well along, an hour or two of good light remained. He guessed if they started at once and the traveling went easily, they might make several miles' progress before bedding down again. His head throbbed from sleep or feast or both. The dogs, too, seemed dazed. They stood and yawned and shook themselves out and somehow slid down to the ground again. He let them lie and snuck downfield for another look at the house. Someone had recently arrived. A plain-looking sedan sat parked next to the stoop, and the trunk was hinged open, and a tall, lean man, maybe 30 years old, was hefting grocery bags out of its depths. The man had already been inside the house, for the back door stood open, but he seemed unalarmed. Edgar smiled to himself. He had begun to take pride in his skill as a burglar. He had turned it into kind of a game, how much he could take before they noticed. Could he rearrange things to hide what was missing? People didn't expect someone to break into their houses to steal a little food. They'd expected to be ransacked, to lose televisions, money, cars, to find their dresser drawers dumped, their mattresses overturned. No one in the cabins, as far as he could tell, had ever done more than scratch their heads at their depleted larder. Who stole half a loaf of bread and then cleaned up after himself? Edgar and the dogs had feasted where this man now unpacked his groceries, and there was a chance he wouldn't even notice. When he returned, Edgar found the dogs sniffing with great interest the package of bacon he'd taken from the kitchen of the little farmhouse. He looked at them and shook his head in disbelief. Edgar himself felt like one of those snakes that swallowed pigs whole. He didn't actually slosh as he walked, but the idea of putting more food inside his belly was laughable. He shooed them away, and they pranced backward and watched him while he stuffed their loot into the satchel. Then he grabbed the Zepco and led the dogs down the bluff. The railroad tracks veered to the northwest. A person could judge whether a train was coming, he had read, by pressing an ear to one of the rails, and he tried it. The scored silver bar was warm but silent. The four of them trotted up the track far enough that a passing motorist wouldn't make much of them. A boy and some dogs, and then, as the night came on, he ambled along tie to tie, feeling content and even swaggering a bit at the thought of their success raiding the farm. Scrubwood paralleled the tracks left and right. Far ahead, a low uncovered bridge waited in the gloaming. Stories came back to him of people struck by trains as they walked the rails, and he wondered how that was possible. Wouldn't anyone hear a train thundering toward him long before it arrived? He hoped one would come by just so he could count off the seconds between the first sound of it and when it passed. These were his thoughts when Tinder first cried out, a yike of surprise and pain that made Edgar's stomach instantly knot in fear. He knew where each of the dogs was. Essay and Babu had been poking along beside him on the ties, as content and lost in thought as he. But Tinder had trotted down the grade to investigate something in a stand of cattails. Probably frogs, Edgar had thought. He even recalled seeing from the corner of his eye Tinder stiffen and pounce. But his attention had been distracted by the tracks, imagining onrushing trains. Tinder's motion had looked unexceptional. The dogs pounced dozens of times each day on toads, frogs, field mice, grasshoppers, who knew what. But this time Tinder let out a shrill and leapt back. Edgar stood watching, unable at first to move. As the dog tried to set his foot down, Tinder shrieked and threw himself down amidst the cattails, holding his right paw in the air and striking at it with his left. Snake bite was Edgar's first coherent thought. Somehow that finally broke his paralysis. He crashed through the weeds below the embankment and dropped to his knees beside Tinder. But even before he touched the dog, he saw the blue-green shard of glass, muddy and jagged, impaled in the bottom of the dog's foot, and the thin spear protruding from the top. Out of reflex, Edgar grabbed Tinder's muzzle. In days to come, he would remember that instinctive motion and think he had at least done one thing right, because Tinder was about to bite the glass and would have gashed his mouth as badly as his foot. Tinder shook off his grip and tried to scramble up. Edgar threw a leg over the dog and rolled him. Tinder lashed his body side to side, kicking a fine crimson spray over them. Then Edgar felt Tinder's teeth on his forearm, but there was no time to see if he had bitten, or how badly. Somehow he had gotten himself kneeling over the dog. Essay and Babu had plunged down the embankment alongside him, and they danced at Tinder's muzzle, worrying and licking his mouth. For a moment Tinder's body went slack as he looked at the other dogs. Now, Edgar thought, knowing he might not get another chance. He gripped Tinder's paw tightly and grasped the crudely serrated wedge of glass between his thumb and forefinger and pulled. There was a horrible sawing as the spear point slid back into Tinder's foot. The glass was slick with blood and mud, and Edgar's thumb slipped along the edge. Had Tinder not jerked his foot back, the tearing sensation in Edgar's thumb would have made him release the shard before it was out of the dog's pad. He felt Tinder's teeth on his forearm, this time harder, but by then it was already done. He dropped the piece of glass and rolled and laid on his side, squeezing his hand and looking at the ragged incision that had appeared in the fleshy front of his thumb. The cut burned like acid, and he shook his hand to slake it. Tinder hobbled away and sank to the ground near the embankment. If the sensation in Edgar's thumb was any measure, Tinder must have been in agony. Edgar curled his thumb into his fist and ran to the dog, blood dripping from between his fingers. He sat panting. Essay and Babu were nosing through the cattails, swiping their tails in curiosity. He stood again and ran to them, panicked at the idea of more broken glass. Clapping his hands until blood splashed across his shirt, he hustled the dogs back toward Tinder, where they scented the dog along his legs and sides until they were certain they had located his wound. The shard of glass lay in the weeds. Edgar picked it up. The broad end had 3 smooth ridges, threads for a jar cap, a fragment of a jelly jar or something like that, pitched into the weeds from a passing train or by another walker of ties. Bloody dirt packed the threads. He flung it angrily into the cattails and forced his thumb out straight and pulled open the gash to look at it. He felt a lump, and then he was sitting. A thump, and then he was sitting. Essay was nosing him and licking his face. When his vision stopped tunneling, he pushed himself to his feet, wobbled, and sank to his knees. Wait, he thought, drawing a breath. Try again. On his next attempt, he was able to stand. He staggered over to Tinder, who lay with his paw curled inward before him, as if cradling some orphaned part of his body, sorrowfully drawing his tongue across the pad. His pelt contracted where Edgar lay a hand on it. Tinder turned away from his injury momentarily to look at Edgar, and with his good hand, Edgar stroked the dog from the top of his head down along his backbone. He palpitated Tinder's back feet, hoping he would understand what was coming. Then Edgar ran his hand along Tinder's foreleg again, this time all the way to his pad, without a protest from the dog beyond a short rumble of apprehension and a lick. A crescent-shaped wound lay in the center of the triangular middle pad, oozing blood and dirt. Edgar didn't attempt to touch it, but slowly, very slowly, rotated the paw until he could look at the blood-stained fur on top. He delicately touched the tips of Tinder's claws, one by one manipulating his toes. When he touched the second toe, Tinder whined and jerked his foot. So that was it. Something in his second toe, maybe not the bone, but there were ligaments, tendons, tiny muscles in there. He released Tinder's leg and stroked him and tried to think. He bent his thumb experimentally. It didn't hurt more bent than straight, which was a good sign, but they could both possibly use stitches. He stood still, wobbly, and retreated a few paces, bringing Essay and Babu around behind him. Tinder lay watching, ears back as if he knew what Edgar was about to ask of him. Come, Edgar signed. Tinder looked at him. He whined, then stood on 3 legs and held his damaged foot in the air, nosing it like a broken thing. Edgar knelt. I'm sorry, he sighed. We have to do this. Then he recalled Tinder again. Tinder set his foot on the ground and jerked it up. He hobbled a step, looked at Edgar, and tried again. When he finally reached Edgar, he dropped to the ground, panting and refusing to meet Edgar's gaze, even when Edgar put his face in front of his. He might be going into shock, Edgar thought. He ran a fingertip along Tinder's gums. They were moist, which was good, but it was obvious that the dog couldn't walk. Edgar got Tinder to his feet by slipping a hand under his belly. He paused one arm behind the dog's back legs and threaded the other under his chest, careful not to touch his dangling foot. He thought if he did it wrong, Tinder might bite him out of panic, and if he dropped the dog, he knew he would not be granted a second try. But Tinder panted in his face and waited, and Edgar came smoothly to his feet. Slowly he made his way up the side of the railroad embankment, digging the toe of each shoe into the gravel before trusting his weight on it. Once on top, he could take only a small step at a time, for fear of tripping on a tie. His thumb throbbed as if it had burst. Tinder hung slack in his arms, as if he concluded that this was how things would be. And that, if nothing else, made Edgar realize how badly the dog's paw had been mangled. Then he remembered the Zebco and the fisherman's satchel lying beside the tracks. He didn't turn back for them. It would be impossible to carry them anyway, and the dark was quickly becoming absolute. He would have to go back later. Far in the distance, headlights glowed, then faded as the car crossed the railroad tracks beneath the bluff they had descended. He focused on that point and took another step. Before they reached the blacktop, he had had to set Tinder down 3 times to let the knots in his back unkink. The dog was heavy, 90 pounds or more, over half Edgar's own weight. Each time they stopped, Tinder tried to walk, managing only to hobble a few yards before lying down. The lucky thing, if that was what it could be called, was that they had gone only about a mile down the track. Essay and Babu had stuck close by, another good thing, since Edgar had no way of signing a recall with his arms full. He picked up Tinder. They began again. Then they stood on the deserted blacktop. The only light came from the window of the little 4-square house beneath the sunflower field. The adrenaline that had first powered Edgar had ebbed, and he staggered along with Tinder in his arms. The asphalt was wonderfully flat and smooth beneath his feet, and when they reached the mailbox, Edgar walked up the driveway under the row of tall trees. In the front yard, the air around the house was alight with fireflies. A June bug buzzed past. Essay and Babu charged ahead and rounded the corner of the house. The moment they disappeared, Tinder began to squirm, and Edgar walked faster. Essay and Babu were milling about on the unlit stoop when he got there. He knelt and guided Tinder down onto the wooden planks. Then he clapped softly and led Essay and Babu a few feet onto the grass and down them as well. When he turned back, a man's face had appeared in the window above the kitchen sink. The porch light flared. Edgar checked the dogs. They lay at attention, watching. The inside door swung open, and the man he had watched carrying groceries from his car that evening looked at him through the screen. "Can I help you?" the man said. His gaze fell on Tinder, panting on the stoop. He looked at Edgar and saw the blood. "You've been in an accident?" Edgar shook his head and signed a response. The man wasn't going to understand sign, but there was no better way to get started. With luck, he'd understand he was being signed at. "My dog is hurt. We need help." The man watched Edgar's hands. Edgar waited while he figured it out. "You're deaf," he said. He shook his head. "You can hear me?" "Yes." Then Edgar gestured toward his throat and shook his head. He made as if to write on his palm. The man looked at him blankly, then said, "Oh, got it right. Just a second." And he disappeared into the house, leaving Edgar to stare into the kitchen he'd ransacked that morning. His legs trembled as he waited. He knelt by Tinder and stroked his ruff and watched as the dog tongued his wounded paw in long strokes, eyes glassy and unfocused as if staring into another world. In the yellow porch light, his bloody fur gleamed back. Then Edgar went to Essay and Babu and set his hands intimately under their jaws, touching them the way he would if everything were okay, and together they watched the doorway. The man returned. He stood behind the screen holding a pencil and pad. His gaze went to Tinder, then to Edgar squatting beside the 2 other dogs. Evidently, he hadn't noticed Essay and Babu before. "Whoa," he said. He put his palm forward and patted the air, as if trying to make everything stay still while he took stock of things. Okay, definitely not an ordinary situation," he said, giving Essay and Babu a wary gaze. "They're friendly?" Edgar nodded. For the man's benefit, he turned and stayed them. There was something morose about the man, Edgar thought. It was an odd idea to have someone he'd just met, but an unmistakable aura of resignation enveloped the man, as though he were one of those people depicted in cartoons who walked around with rain clouds over their heads, people whose change fell out of their pockets when they bent down to pick up a penny. The man's reaction to Essay and Babu only reinforced this impression, as if somehow he had been expecting to find a pack of ferocious dogs outside his door one day. He didn't smile. His expression was guarded, though not unfriendly, but he didn't frown either. If anything, his eyes conveyed a look of benign misgiving, the result of some lifelong despondency. "Right," he said, "trained but friendly, yes?" "Yes." He peered into the dark. "Any more out there?" Edgar shook his head, and he'd have smiled if his stomach hadn't been churning with anxiety. The man opened the screen door and stepped out, fixing the dogs with a doubtful look. Edgar took the pencil and the pad. My dog cut his foot. I need water to clean it in a pan or bucket. They looked down at Tinder. Are any people hurt? No. I should call a doctor, the man said. Edgar shook his head vehemently. What's wrong with your voice? Did you hurt your throat somehow? No. You've always been that way? Yes. The man thought for a second. Okay, wait. I'll be right back. He walked inside. Edgar heard some clinking and rattling and then water running in the kitchen sink. And in a moment, the man emerged carrying a white enamel pot, water sloshing over the sides. A ratty blue towel was tucked under his arm. Here, he said, setting the pot down on the planks of the stoop. It's warm. You can get started with this. I'll get you a bucket and see what else I've got. Edgar carried the pot to Tinder and ladled up a handful of water and held it out for the dogs to smell. Tinder was panting hard, and he licked the water from his fingertips. Edgar dipped the rag into the water and ran his hand down Tinder's foreleg. The dog whined and poked his nose at Edgar anxiously, but let him dab at the dirt on his foot. Edgar rinsed the rag. The water clouded and turned brown. He pressed his face to Tinder's muzzle while he soaked the cloth against Tinder's pad again and again. Each time the rag came away covered with a mixture of blood and muck. The man emerged carrying a metal bucket and walked to a spigot that projected from the house's foundation. It squeaked when he turned it. Fresh water sprayed out. While the bucket was filled, he turned to Edgar. If I bring this over, will it spook your dog? Edgar had his arm over Tinder's back. He didn't think a stranger's approach would scare him, but it was a good question to ask, and his opinion of the man went up a notch. No. The man toted the bucket over and set it a cautious distance away and sat. The water in the small enamel pot was gritty and brown. The man reached over and tipped the dirty water out and dipped into the bucket and returned it. Essay and Babu groaned behind Edgar. It had been a mistake to place them where his back would be turned, making them more likely to break their stays out of curiosity. He sat up straight, keeping one hand on Tinder's withers, and gestured to the man to stay still. The man nodded. Edgar turned and looked at the two dogs, who tucked their feet and locked gazes with him. Come, he signed. They bounded forward. Edgar worried that Tinder would forget his wound and rise to meet them, but the pressure of his hand between the dog's shoulder blades kept him steady. Essay and Babu charged around them, heads reared back to get close with their chests while taking the stranger in widely. I hope you meant it when you said they were friendly, the man said. He was sitting very straight, trying to look at them both at once. Then he gave up and just looked at whichever dog happened to be in front of him. Oh, buddy, he muttered. Okay. When they'd discharged enough of their curiosity, Edgar clapped and gestured to a spot in the grass nearby. At first they refused. Edgar clapped again, and they trotted over, grumbling. He selected a spot where they could watch what was going on, and he felt them relax now that they could make eye contact with him. He turned back to cleaning Tinder's paw. The fresh water had dirtied again, though now more bloody than brown. You're hurt, too, the man said. Edgar nodded. His thumb blazed each time he dipped it into the wash water, but it reminded him how Tinder felt when he dabbed the cold cloth across his paw. What happened? Edgar stopped washing Tinder's paw long enough to pantomime spiking the flat of one hand on two fingers of another. Oh, ouch, the man said, and he watched in silence for a while. Okay, he said at last. Tell you what, I'm going back inside to see what I've got in my medicine cabinet. Here, let me get that. He reached over and dumped the pan and refilled it from the bucket again. I might have mercurochrome or hydrogen peroxide. Edgar concentrated entirely on Tinder now. He'd cleaned most of the dirt away, and he needed to swab between Tinder's toes and around the pad. He'd maneuvered the dog's paw so that he could submerge it in the pan entirely. The water turned brown. Tinder yelped and jerked, but Edgar slowly worked his finger between Tinder's toes again, dumping the water several times while the man was gone. Then the man, squatting down in front of them, he sat down a metal pan wrapped with tin foil, on top of which lay a collection of bottles retrieved from his medicine chest. One of them was Tylenol. He opened the bottle and held out 2 capsules. Maybe you should take a couple of these, he said. Edgar popped them into the back of Tinder's mouth at once and pointed the dog's muzzle upward and stroked his throat until his tongue swiped his nose. Then he scooped up a handful of clear water from the bucket and let Tinder lap it. The man nodded. He held out 2 more capsules, which Edgar quickly swallowed. Right, the man said. Also, I've got something these guys might be interested in. He folded back the foil and lifted a hunk of brown stew meat between his thumb and forefinger. the meat Edgar had taken from the freezer that morning to replace the stone bratwurst. I just made this tonight. It's even a little warm. Edgar nodded and released the two watchers. There was a time, he thought, when the dogs would have checked with him before accepting food from a stranger. They'd been drilled on it in town, but that was a remnant of a life long ago. Cast aside by animals who hunted frogs and snakes and ate ripe turtle eggs, Essay and Babu arranged themselves around the man, ears up, waiting their turn as he flicked hunks of glistening beef onto the grass. The man acted almost bashful under their combined gaze. With trepidation, he allowed Tinder to take the meat directly from his hands. But Edgar was grateful for any distraction that allowed him to more thoroughly wash Tinder's wound. When the meat was gone, the man let Tinder lick the gravy off his fingers and pushed the pan out with his foot for the other dogs to clean up. He had a wry expression on his face. Edgar got the feeling that this might be the happiest the man could look. "Call it what you will," the man said, "but this is definitely not ordinary." We'll stop there. Have a great day.